Welcome to what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating and lively discussion. I'm Casey Seiler. I'm the state editor for the Albany Times Union and the co-host of New York Now on WMHT. I'd like to welcome you all here and to the people in the overflow room. Doing well over there? Good, awesome, excellent. Just a little program today. We're going to hear presentations from our keynote and from our 4 panelists. Then we'll have a discussion amongst all these large-brained folks, and then we'll take your questions near the very end. I'm very happy to serve as your MC for this. My grandmother was a teacher in a small public school in Northern Ontario. My mother was a teacher and past age 70 continues to substitute teach in the Louisville and the Jefferson County public school system. My sister, after graduating, taught for a couple of years at Hotchkiss, which is over in Western Connecticut and is not a small public school in Northern Ontario, if any of you are familiar with it. My brother is a teacher of American Studies, and when time came for him to marry, he, of course, married an English professor. When I came to choose a wife, as they used to say, I proposed to a woman who I was sure was going to be a high-level executive in the media business. And of course, after I proposed, she told me that she wanted to go back to school and get her teaching credential. So how that did not happen is a very long story. But to kick off the proceedings, I would like to welcome to the podium the director of the Rockefeller Institute, Tom Gaze.
Thank you very much, Casey. I don't have quite that family background in teaching, although my mother grew up in central Kentucky in the Appalachian Hills, and her father, a tobacco farmer, told her that, and as the other 9 children, that they all had to get teaching degrees. This is the only thing that he could think of that is going to be needed for the foreseeable future back from the perspective of the 1930s. In any event, welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for coming. It's been delightful for the Institute, especially Bob Bullock, our deputy director here, to work with Michael Borges and the New York State Association of School Business Officials. It's a wonderful collaboration, and we look forward to working with the association in the future as well. This is the third of forums on fiscal stress in New York State. I hope that the economy gets so good in the future that we don't have to have these series any longer. The first 2 were last year. We had them our last academic year. We had the controller, Tom DiNapoli, speak here, a very thoughtful piece about the local government fiscal issues. And we had Dick Ravitch, former lieutenant governor, and someone the Institute has worked with on a number of projects over the last few years. And it's been, but after those 2 very excellent forums, Michael and others at the association came to us and decided that schools, of course, raise some very important issues and are in difficult situation above all, and so that merited a special forum on the school district and the school fiscal stress issue itself. So thank you very much for coming. There are going to be a couple of other forums that you may want to take note of. One, on Monday, we're going to be up at Clarkson University and have a forum on higher education institutions as economic drivers. Then on November 6th, Wednesday, we will have a forum on waste, fraud, and abuse in government. Now, some of you may be a little worried about the possibility that we may cancel that if we don't have a federal government at that point, but you can rest assured this will be about state and local government. So thank you very much, and back to Casey.
And now to introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to bring to the podium Mike Borges, the executive director of one of our hosting organizations today, the State Association of School Business Officials.
Thank you. I want to, again, thank everybody for coming out this morning to hear about these important issues that are facing our public schools. Since I've been on board with the Association of School Business Officials about a year and a half ago, we've been trying to drum the beat and be the canary in the coal mine about schools and their finances and the fiscal stress that they're under. And this is sort of a culmination of those efforts and bringing this important issue to the forefront of policymakers, the media, and the public. Before I turn it back over to Casey, I just want to refer to a book by Malcolm Gladwell called The Tipping Point. He defines the term, the tipping point, as the moment of critical mass, the threshold, the boiling point. Our speakers and panelists today will discuss whether our educational system has reached the tipping point, whether a critical mass of our school districts are facing educational or fiscal insolvency, whether our schools have reached the threshold of not being able to deliver a sound basic education to all of our students. But I have no doubt that the feeling of many in the room today and across the state who are concerned about the well-being of our students and the integrity of our public schools have reached the boiling point. I am hopeful that the discussion here today will spur an honest and forthright dialogue that welcomes outside-the-box thinking and ultimately leads to a course of action that will bring us to a brighter future for our students, our public schools, and indeed the future of our state. So again, thank you all for coming out this morning, and I want to turn it back over to Casey.
And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, John Sipple, forgive me, from Cornell's Department of Developmental Sociology. He has focused his research interests on the response of public school districts to changes in state and federal policy. He comes to the issue after more than a decade, about 13 years with the Department of Education, is that correct? And I know that what he has to say is going to be of interest to all of us. Please welcome John Sipple.
Thank you so much. This is a real pleasure to be here. I have never, I've not been to this building before. This is really kind of exciting for me, both for the building, but it's a bit different. I've never had quite the experience of speaking into two different rooms at once. So let me know if I need to speak up or if I need to be more interesting or calm down or whatever I need to do. So the teleprompter is here. Again, thank you. I want to thank Carl Hayden. I don't know if Carl's here, but he's the one who called me up a good, 6 weeks ago to see if I would do this. I'd be interested in speaking to this group. And I jumped at the chance. And this is a wonderfully challenging topic, a wonderful topic to use as a forum to bring a diverse range of voices together. And my task and my goal this morning is really to set the table for a more detailed conversation around the different viewpoints on this. I'm trying to be provocative. I'll try to give you a big bird's eye view of the bigger, almost philosophical issues around this with just a little bit of data. And then we have other speakers, Deborah and Rick and the others who will dive much deeper into the details around the finances, around the dollars. But I'm going to try and do something a little bit different. Because there are other folks, there's the Bruce Bakers of the world, there's the Bruce Frasers of the world, who do a lot of these analyses as well. I'm not nearly as smart as these other folks, and I'm not nearly as well versed in that level of detail. And so I'm going to do something a little bit different to set the stage for hopefully a lot of questions and a lot of discussion as we get going. All right. Let's just get going here. Here we go. So key questions. What is insolvency? This term educational insolvency was handed to me and said, can you speak about educational insolvency? And that connotes a number of different interpretations, a number of different issues. And you hear the term insolvency, we think immediately of dollars and bankruptcies and so forth. I'm going to broaden that definition a little bit in my remarks this morning. How do we get to this point? How do we get to this point where we have this level of stress, this level of challenge across the great state of New York? This is not where we thought we would be. back in 2006 or 7, thanks to Mike and his lawsuit. But boy, here we are, and so there's been extraordinary changes, and what is at stake, and finally, what should we do? How do we think about moving forward in this environment? Okay, quick preview. I am not going to give you a flurry of tables, although I have a flurry of slides, and so I'm talking out of two sides of my mouth. There are some numbers, there are some tables. There are others that will do that much better than I will, and so forth. One of my arguments is that the problems that we're facing are as much political, if not more political, than technical. And we can agree or disagree with that, but let's have that conversation. I think there's some things that we can, most like minds can agree upon as far as how we've gotten to this point and maybe where we should go. But the political part is really a tricky question. My view, and this is my view, and I know there's others on the panel who may agree and others on the panel who disagree with this, is that there's enough money out in the system right now. We spend a lot of money. 1 out of every $10 spent on the K-12 system across the country is spent right here in New York State. So I'm not going to be here and advocating for new dollars coming in, but boy, I will be advocating and arguing for how we use those dollars, both at the local level with local decisions of how we spend our money and in the distribution across the state with the state money. Okay. All right. This phrase, educational insolvency, I call it a relative term. It's pretty clear when somebody goes bankrupt or a school district goes bankrupt. And of course, we still don't quite know what that means. And maybe Tim can tell us exactly what that means and what school districts should do when they get there. I have no answer for that one. But this broader term, educational insolvency, on the educational end of it, what does this mean for kids to have they're going through an educational program, they're one shot in their life, they get to go through this. And what if their education is actually insolvent? The quality of the program is insolvent. And that's some of the conversation I want to start today. Okay. You give the professor a microphone, and you got to be careful, okay? I couldn't help myself with some of these things. Bear with me, there's a rhyme and a reason for this, okay? You may or may not be familiar with these different pieces of history that fundamentally shaped the system we have today, okay? And going way back to Thomas Jefferson's original plan, which was never approved. This is a plan he proposed in Virginia for the public funding of essentially primary schooling around the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia. It was never approved, but he argued vociferously for this. There's Horace Mann's Common School Plan, which was never fully funded, but was certainly put in play in different ways. I'll talk about that for a second. James Conant, the former president of Harvard, his plan for the Comprehensive American High School. And sure enough, that we did get these Comprehensive American High Schools, and we'll talk about his reasons for doing that. And of course, what I'm calling the Clinton, Bush, Obama, King Plan. Which is all, and this is seriously, the last 15 years or so, we've been at this game trying to gain more productivity, gain more efficiency in our schools, multiple presidential administrations, multiple federal initiatives and reforms, and it's kind of a two-headed horse, as I'll talk about in a second. Okay, Jefferson's plan, real quick. Okay, this is one of my favorite quotes when I teach about this. And I'm sharing these because these are different views on why we have a public educational system, why we're engaged in this at all. Why should we spend $1 educating somebody else's kid? $1 of public money. Why should we do that? And Jefferson, with all the folklore around Jefferson, look at his language. Okay, 20 of the best geniuses will be raked from the rubbish, meaning we're going to publicly fund elementary education, primary education, so that we can dig in through all the rubbish, these terrible kids out there, and find the genius in that rubbish. And this is Thomas Jefferson's language. It's not mine. Don't quote me on that one. But he also said, and look at the second line here, we hope to avail the state of those talents which nature has sown as liberally among the poor as the rich. He recognized that you need to have these schools properly run in poor areas as well as wealthy areas, because there were properly sown geniuses in all communities around the Commonwealth of Virginia. And that's an important piece. Okay, so this is the notion of school as a sorter and an identifier of talent. A school is selector. Okay. All right, Horace Mann's plan. He had this idea that we have these neighborhoods, we have these communities, we have these regions, and there's something good, there's something beneficial to the community, beneficial to the state, to have all these kids from a particular region come to school together and learn something in common, okay? This word Common Core, I think, is not lost on us right here. But this was supposed to be common to that community at a very local level. The materials upon which it operates are so pliant and ductile. This is a view that the kids are really, really malleable. We need to get them when they're young so we can shape them to become good citizens, moral citizens, religious citizens, in his own definition of religion. But the notion is not just that kids are who they are and we can pluck out the geniuses or rake the geniuses out, okay? But it's that we can actually shape all these kids and shape the communities in which they're coming from. Okay, so this is school as change agent. That schools can be active, they have agency, they can actually go ahead and change the lives of these kids, not just select out a few. Conant, who did all kinds of things. You ever want to read about an interesting guy, read about James Conant, really quite remarkable. Similar in that he built on Mann's idea that you have this region, you draw these boundaries, we call them school districts. Okay, and inside the school districts, you have all kinds of different people. He was big at promoting diversity at Harvard at the time when he was president, and he was big on promoting diversity in these schools. He did not want wealthy kids to go off to one another school. He said all these kids should go to school together, but not that they all would be educated the same way. They would mingle in the cafeteria. They would mingle maybe in, call it different things, but phys ed class. Okay, not in math. We'll have these different tiers of math, different tiers of English, and so forth. And so there's this combination of a communitarian kind of goal here, a socializing role, also with this more finely tuned training. Okay, so think about that as a model of what we're trying to accomplish today as well. So schools essentially is all things to all people. Okay, and then we have this notion that all kids can achieve at high levels. Okay, we should leave no child behind. Every kid deserves this. Every kid deserves this equal educational opportunity and should be pushed and tugged and incentivized to achieve at high levels and be college and career ready and all this good stuff. But there's this notion of very strong influence of market forces in this, the growth of charter schools, the growth of voucher programs and so forth. I talked to Deborah about voucher programs out in Nevada. And so forth. So there's this notion of that there's this communitarian good, and yet there's this competition in there. And this is a really dicey concept, and how can we have both at once? All right, so schools caught between consumerism, one way to think about it, and egalitarian ideas or ideals. Okay, big picture of enrollment, and this is the system we built. And I always do this with my own students, go way back and try to understand where we've been so we can understand where we are today. Over on the right is where we are today, and you see we have reached equilibrium. Okay, we have near universal education today. That line's not 100%, but it's pretty close. Okay, but clearly we've reached equilibrium. So the red line is the enrollment of percent of 5 to 17-year-olds. So amongst that population, 5 to 17-year-olds, what proportion were enrolled in schools? And you go back even to 1870, and we still had 65% of kids at that age in schools. The high schools, this is Conant's idea, was to get these older kids, the 13 to 17-year-olds or so in school. And this is your green line, the percent of total enrollment in high schools. And we started with virtually nobody in high school other than these private academies. And now this has become very stable, very institutionalized, and no one's questioning whether we should have kids in high school. Of course, the question is what we should do with them. Notice the blue line. This is the percent of the entire U.S. population. Okay, so the enrollment in schools, and this is remarkably steady. There's all kinds of things that go on with immigration and migration, in-migration, out-migration, all kinds of issues here, but that's a remarkably steady line, and that's an interesting note that we'll try to come back to later. Okay, again, this issue of equilibrium. We have reached a state of where there's equilibrium, and as the question was brought up earlier, is this about to change? I don't think that's going to change. I don't think we're going to reach a point where kids are not going to school, even though we still have this extraordinarily large dropout problem. But this is the number of school districts. In New York State, in the blue, we used to have, as many of you know, almost 12,000 school districts in the state. This dropped dramatically when there's all kinds of changes going on in society, all kinds of consolidation, the rise of the superintendents, the rise of broader school boards for multiple communities. and this dropped. But since 1970, it's been stunningly stable. Despite all this incentive aid, despite all this financial stress in recent years, this is not changing very much at all. Will this change dramatically over the next 10 years? We'll see. It may. There's a lot of conversation out there now around mergers. Many more conversations today than before. Although if you look at the last couple of years, there's still communities voting down mergers and so forth. And if you think New York is an aberration, the red line's the U.S. Okay, the scale is over on the right side. We used to have 120,000 school districts across the country, and now we're down to about 16,000. Again, reached equilibrium. Will that change? Oops, fancy graphics. Money. Again, Deborah's going to get into this in more detail, and I'm sure Rick will as well. EJ and right down the line, we'll talk about money. Back in time, this was a very local function, very, very local function of funding our schools. So 1920, 1930, okay, very, very localized. More than 80% of the dollars were coming from localities, and just a teeny tiny bit from the feds, and then a little bit from the state. And this changed quite dramatically with the rise of the high school. This changed dramatically with the rise of state leadership and state interests in having a more educated populace. Okay, and you see where the state funding has superseded the local funding. So that people wonder why the state wants so much control over the local decision making, and who's paying the bill gets to choose the what's going on here. And this has dropped at the very end here. This is our recession at the end. Okay, and you see the locality is now going to be back right above the local contribution at the same or slightly higher than the state contribution. Then the federal, the green line at the bottom actually scares me, okay? Even though that looks healthy, that's a temporary healthy curve right there. And we know that the race to the top, that money came in to save the day, which is why it had such power when states were falling all over themselves, legislatures are falling all over themselves to pass laws to increase their chances to get race to the top money. And we got our $700 million here in New York State, and we all know that money's disappearing. Okay, and then sequester cuts, and then who knows what's going to happen now. It's interesting times. New York State, so these are national numbers. Okay, New York State's current rate, 9% of the dollar, 9% of the average, of the median school district school budget is coming from the federal government. There we go. 41% from the state, and 50% from localities. So we're a bit out of kilter with the national trends on this one, okay? Many reasons for this, not the least of which is the more recent tax cap and so forth in New York State that is suppressing the growth in local contribution. And the more to the point, the cuts in the recent state aid. Okay, just a quick look. This is New York State data across the from 1993 onwards, and you see the relatively stable percent of state aid. And again, think about this as a typical school budget and what proportion is coming from what different sector. And this is the proportion coming from the state. So these are percentages. Hard to see those colors. So you got New York City, big fours in the red. Small cities are green. High need rurals are that purpley kind of line up near the top, and so forth. All right, and what you see is this is the recent state aid cuts. Okay, no surprise there. What you see with this arrow is the result of the CFE decision. Okay, we saw this upward pressure on the contributions from the state. They were very real, tangible progress with that one, and of course now we have the downward pressure of the recession. And you see where this balances out. Will this reach equilibrium? We'll see. We'll see. Okay, just to look at the revenues from locality. Notice these lines have a slight uptick at the end. This is localities trying to respond to the cuts in state aid. Okay, they're constrained, intentionally so, by the tax cap, and so there's only so much that we can make up locally. But the ability to levy taxes local, the ability to raise money locally, is the next major part of what I want to share here. This is so unbelievably uneven of the local ability to raise local money. And so when the state caps its aid and the state locks in at a 2% increase or so, of local revenues has phenomenally different effects. Okay, and here's one way to look at this ability to levy local taxes. Between 93 and about 2001 or so, you see these differences. Okay, the top line there are low-need districts. So we have approximately, $500,000 of property wealth per pupil. Okay, so if you're taxing this, and you can do your simple math to calculate your ability to, when you increase your tax rate by X percent and you increase your levy by 2%, depending on the size of the district, you can roughly calculate how much money is going to come in at the wealthy end of things. The other districts are clustered down low, with the high-need rural is that bottom line of purple, competing with the big four is the red line there. Okay, and then we hit some boom times in the state. Okay, and the wealthy got extraordinarily wealthy in this way of defining wealth. Okay, property value that's taxable. Okay, and on a per pupil basis here. So now we're well over about $1.8 million, $1.8 million per pupil that you can levy. Okay, the property values that you have to tax. Okay, per kid in the wealthiest communities, and these lower lines here are moving up, but nowhere near the same rate or at the same level. So we have this phenomenal difference. So when you're doing your increase in local levies, okay, based on the constrained by 2% cap, you're getting a phenomenally different return on that. Okay, so what I call the big squeeze. Okay, broad range of issues that they're all playing into why we're in the situation today. Not the least of which in many areas. There's been some areas of growth, of population growth around the Albany area, a little bit around the Fort Drum area with the war, certainly down in parts of New York City and outside New York City. But most of the rest of upstate has lost a phenomenal amount of population, and hence you lose a lot of students. So your unit cost is going up. People have said to me, why is it that these schools can't just reduce their costs as quickly as they're losing people? I said, well, if you have 100 students in your school, to keep the math easy, and you're losing 2% of people a year, 2% of kids, okay, you're going to lose 2 kids out of that school. And if those kids are spread over 6 grades or 3 grades or 10 grades, depending on the size, exactly what do you cut? And you can save a few sheets of paper. Okay, you've already bought the textbooks. You can't sell them back to the company. Which teacher are you going to lay off because you lost 2% of your population that one year? So the next year you lose another 2%, next year another 2%. And it's hard to scale back when you have the population loss. Okay. Not only are we losing population, but they're getting poorer. Communities are getting poorer. Increasing diversity, increasing minority populations, a variety of reasons there. ESL population. Okay. Each of these we know from generations of research and generations of experience, these kids are more expensive to teach. Not an even swap. Revenue constraints. We talked about the tax cap, state aid cap. I put property wealth concentration as a revenue constraint, not for the wealthy areas, but as you concentrate wealth, okay, it means you're losing wealth from other parts of the state. And so in these other areas, which still teach a lot of kids and have that responsibility to teach a lot of kids, you have this kind of hollowing out of the ability to levy local taxes there. Same with income concentration, very similar story. The property value concentration, the income concentration. And we got some maps we can show you what that looks like. Race to top funding, which is not a revenue constraint. That was a revenue welcome for a while. Then people saw the strings attached to that and the local contribution they have to make to match the federal. But now the sequester and, of course, the cuts. I think there's a lot of expectation that federal aid will be decreasing in the future. We'll see if it does, but there's a lot of expectation it will. Okay, so we finally get to insolvency. Okay, and there's this notion of financial insolvency, in that when is it that school districts will run out of money, okay, and not be able to meet their contractual demands and create this dilemma of what do we do? When a business can't meet its contractual demands, it goes into bankruptcy and receivership and so forth. What happens to a school? We thought, many of us had these conversations. We thought we'd see this 2 years ago. We thought we'd see this last year. And then there's educational insolvency, all right? And this is more the quality of the educational opportunity, quality of the outcomes, the productivity of these schools, okay? And this has, depending on how you think about this, is legally, socially, technically unacceptable. When it gets bad enough, however we define that, and we can define that in different ways, of what's good enough for our kids. I worry greatly. As many of you know, I do a lot of work with rural schools across the state, and there's a sense that we can do this. We didn't have those programs when we were kids, so we don't need them now. And what you get is a real thinning of the curriculum, real thinning of the opportunities. And of course, that's okay if everybody's thinning. But in this competitive world today, we are systematically disenfranchising and systematically decreasing the future opportunities of these kids as we thin out these opportunities for the kids. Okay. We thought we'd see this happen, and we really haven't. Not that there's not financial constraint and stress and all the rest, but we haven't seen the insolvency like we thought we might see it. Maybe this year, maybe next year. Not that I'm hoping for it, but it may come. In the educational insolvency, we fear this is happening right now. Not in every community, but if you go back to Jefferson's notion that we need to reach into the poor communities and reach into the wealthy communities and reach into every community to find these geniuses, if that's your view. Okay. I talked about population loss. This is just a little map. You might recognize it, New York State. Okay. I apologize for the white little dots. This is a variety of reasons for missing data points, but that's what those white dots are. On the right, the colors are okay up here on the screen. Anything yellow, that yellowish color, you're about dead even. It's just change in enrollment, student enrollment per district over a 3-year time period. So this would be between 1994 and 1997. Three-year time change there. And you see there's some dark green districts that are increasing enrollment by 10% or so. Dark red districts decreasing enrollment by 10% or so. Okay? This is 96, 97. Let's jump ahead. And this is between 2009 and 2012. Okay? There's green areas. There's yellow areas. But boy, that's a lot of red. Right? I'm going to show you it's not a video, it's just an animated map, just for dramatic effect to make sure that we keep you awake and excited here. And I want you to think about it as you're watching this next little map. What causes this? What are the cost implications of what you're going to see on the map? What are the implications of insolvency, educational insolvency? Okay, I'm not going to talk too much about the financial insolvency, but the educational insolvency. When the programs get so thin that kids are being systematically hampered, what are the cost implications of that to the state, to those individuals? In this issue of causal inference, okay, which way do the causal arrows go? Sorry about this. Okay, looks similar. This is.
You're in the way, John. Sorry, I've drawn a blank.
All right. This is. Stand over here. Get out of the way. All right. Same map, same idea. It's the same. We have these set of data tools that do all these different things. This is the percentage of free or reduced lunch. Essentially, a rough estimate of poverty. It's what we use. It's because it's what we have. Is it the best measure? No, but it's what we have. And this is looking at 0102. Okay, the 0102 school year. And again, you see where there's the yellow. We have about a 40% FERPL rate, free lunch rate. Where you see more green, you have something less than that. The real dark greens are down in the single digits, if not close to zero, of the free lunch rate. Up the top, you get the more orangey, brownish, and up to the deep red, and that's where you have these 60, 70, 80, 90% free lunch rates. Okay? See the drama here? 02, 03, 03, 04, 04, 05, 5, 6, 6, 7, 7, 8, 8, 9, 9, 10, and 11, 12. Okay. We are losing population, which increased our unit costs. We're shifting out our population to more expensive kids to teach, okay, for a variety of reasons. And look at all those dark reds now. Look at all the brownish, okay? They're still green. We see our healthy suburbs, okay? We see the donut effect around the cities, around Syracuse. You can pick out Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, and so forth. Not hard to see that. But you see these big, what I call the poverty S-curve in New York State. We start up here, and we down the southern tier, this whole S-curve here was some wealth in here, real wealth here, and of course wealth down here. So can we go back to the regular presentation? Okay. So demographics are changing, okay, in ways that make it more costly to educate, okay? And yet at the very same time that we have this tremendous financial constraint. Okay. This is a chart I made about three years ago. The idea here, this is when the tax cap had been approved, or law had been passed, but before it really took effect. And many of us made these projections of what would happen to various financial indicators. And this is actually looking at the unrestricted fund balance of school districts. Okay, broken out by, a little hard to see the colors here. The bright red are the high need rurals. The black is the high need urban suburban, the small cities. Essentially, the average need is the darker gray, and the low need, or the light gray, and the low need is the darker gray up top. So these are your low need districts here. And so remember, part of the reason the governor wanted a tax cap is he says there are too many local governments sitting on too much of the public money. Okay, we should give the money back to the localities, whether it be a municipality or whether it be a school district. And lo and behold, for the high need rurals, they had the most fund balance per pupil. Okay, some could call that stealing the public's money. Some could call that good financial planning. Two sides of the same coin, maybe. Okay, and you project with some basic assumptions here. Okay, what happens as you roll out into the future? And what you see is the small cities were projected to run out of fund balance. Okay, and so meaning you couldn't balance your budget with a fund balance anymore, so you'd be in real severe financial constraint. Okay, and so the sum total of fund balance would be gone by 2013-14 or so, 14-15. The high need rurals are going to precipitously drop the fastest. That slope is the steepest. Okay, and the wealthies were going to fare this okay. Okay. By and large, this is sort of held up, except the fund balances have not gone dry. They've gotten smaller in most places. Okay, but the fund balances have not dried up. So why not? Many indicators of this, and I meant to go steal some work of Bob Lowery, who has a similar kind of finding, but I ran out of time to do that, so I have my version of that, but it presents similar findings. Here we have different options that districts have engaged in. This was data collected last winter and spring. Okay, so it's very, very current. And what proportion of districts responded that they considered bankruptcy, explored consolidation, sold off assets, cut personnel, increased user fees, eliminated services, reduced services, or exhausted your fund balance. Okay, and so what you see broken out by the different types of districts, okay, is that most everybody cut personnel. No surprise. Okay, a lot of reduction of services. Okay, about half the districts eliminated services and programs. Okay, user fees was less. The small cities sold off some assets. Okay, explored consolidation. There's reasonable number. Okay, and notice the blue lines are always less. The blue lines are the wealthier districts, so of course they're going to be doing this less. But you see the bankruptcy and the consolidation. These are much lower than I would have expected. So my argument, is the result of the financial constraint and the changing demographics of the population in all these different districts is, one, we were a bit slow to restructure contracts. Now, I'm not here to advocate one side or the other on that. I'm just kind of stating what happened. There's been much more in the last year or so with a lot of forward thinking about restructuring contracts. Most scaled back or cut programs, courses, and so forth. Most cut staff. Many began sharing services. Many continued to share service like they did before. Okay, there's a lot of shared services going on. Fund balance became squeezed but not exhausted. And there's a spike in merger discussions, but we haven't really gotten there yet in terms of actual merger. So what happened was we expected districts to go into merger and expected districts to go into bankruptcy. And to avoid those two things, they kept cutting and cutting and cutting program. Okay. So in short, okay, if the aim was to squeeze the districts into merger and insolvency, that initiative failed, if that was the intent. Okay, and some people argued that was the intent. We can debate that. Okay, but rather what we've seen is a lot of cutting. I use the word gutted. Some districts, I think that's appropriate. Some districts, that's an overstatement. But there's been a lot of cutting. But the gutting part worries me. Okay, so how bad is it? How bad did this get? We don't have good data on this. Okay, we don't have good data on exactly what courses were cut, exactly how educational opportunity was hindered by this. We have anecdotal stories, we have little stories here and there, but no systematic data yet. Okay, but we will. Okay, so this notion of how to measure educational insolvency, how do you measure educational opportunity, how do you measure this stuff with real live data? We're about to walk into a period where we're going to be able to do this like we've never been able to do it before. And this, for those of us who kind of get excited about this, we get excited, all right? We're going to be able to peek inside of virtually any classroom in the state. Not with a video camera, okay, not with NSA data, but we're going to peek inside with the new state data system that has been being created for the last 4 or 5 years, okay? This will come online soon, and with appropriate provisions and permissions requested and all the rest, there will be a chance to study exactly what these classrooms look like. And I have just a little diagram here. The unit in the data set, the database the state's creating, the course is the main unit. It's the main core of the data set. And then you populate the courses with students, and students have different races, students have different financial backgrounds, you know, poor, not poor. We don't know much better data than that, but it's what we got, okay? Students have different language abilities and so forth. And we can start peering into these classrooms, look at who's taking what courses, how big the courses are. Other districts are still teaching chemistry to 5 kids, which is a phenomenally expensive way to do it, okay? Or this district, you know, just how does the distribution of students look in the school building? Our honors course is much smaller than the remedial courses. Now, how do we distribute resources within the school, and how do we distribute resources between students? Okay, this is a hypothetical example here. School A, School B. Let's pretend School A and School B both have similar minority populations and similar percentages of poverty. Okay, you peek into 2 classrooms, one class of physics, one class of global. We know the teacher characteristics, we know their APPR scores, we know a lot about the educational training of the teacher and so forth. We know then how many students are in the class. Okay, where do we get more productivity out of this? We know the percent minorities. If we're talking educational opportunity, and there's 37% poor kids, and we only find 2% or 3% of poor kids in those advanced classes, okay? What's going on in that school as far as affording educational opportunity over the course of the K through 12 experience? Okay, so options to avoid this insolvency, and this we're talking a little bit the financial insolvency, but a lot the curricular, programmatic, educational insolvency. Many have argued merger, okay? As the governor's phrase, this would result in fundamental financial reform. I publicly disagreed with this. Op-ed piece I did on this one. It's not that I don't think merger is appropriate in some places, but as a fundamental strategy for financial reform, I think that's not the most efficient way to go. And certainly we don't have the political will to do that now. Okay. What about this idea of create a metric where the districts are taxing themselves the highest and have the lowest performance? So kind of make a mathematical metric and then say those districts, we're going to put the real pressure on you to merge with others, break them apart, somehow mechanically get at those districts. With the argument, if parents push back and say, wait a minute, you're spending much more than you possibly can spend, okay? And your outcomes are crummy. So at least there's a bit of rationality to that, and it's hard for a parent to get upset about that. Regional high schools, a lot of conversation about this. There's no less than 5 or 6 bills that have been floating around the last couple of years on this. In these small, little rural high schools, in terms of the AP offerings, honors offerings, basic science offerings, really getting thin. How thin we don't know yet. We're going to find out very soon. But these can certainly, the scale economies of larger schools can play a big role in that. Shared services, there's a lot of this going on. I think there will be more, but there's an awful lot of this going on. We're about to release a couple different studies on this. Technology. I think there's issues of contracts to get in the way of this technology. We need to really think long and hard about how it is that the educational system can finally gain benefits, gain efficiencies from the use of technology. Not that it's going to replace teachers, but this, how do we work this in to finally think about that? Okay. Let's not guess about the impact. Okay, let's measure this. So let's track very carefully the next few years what this actually looks like, where we have educational insolvency and where we don't, how the resources are distributed both across the state and how the resources are distributed inside these buildings. Okay, we can then assess based on our expectations of what these schools are really for. And so what is our goal of our public educational system? As we take our tax dollars and distribute them out to run an educational system, what exactly are we trying to do? I want us to think about that really carefully when we start looking at the outcomes. So, thank you.
I'd like to note that John woke in what had to be the wee hours to get here from Ithaca, so his ability to present that so cogently is a tribute to his classroom skills, or perhaps the power of the coffee that he is drinking right now. And now we'll hear 4 more perspectives on this issue. First, from Deborah Cunningham, who currently serves as the Director of Education and Research for Mike Borges' organization, the Association of School Business Officials. She has just returned from a sojourn on the left-hand side of the country as the Deputy Superintendent of Administration and Fiscal Services for the Nevada Department of Education, and before that, many years at the New York State Education Department, including serving as the Coordinator of Educational Management Services. Deborah Cunningham.
Good morning. It is truly great to be here discussing the all-important topic of school district fiscal stress, to be part of this distinguished panel, and to see so many old friends. I'm thrilled to be starting my tenure with the New York State Association of School Business Officials with this forum. I've always believed that the school district business official was the unsung hero in education. It is the business official with 1 foot in finance and 1 foot in education who is key to making critical decisions about how to use resources to improve student learning. And it is the business official who is directly charged with giving the business of education integrity, transparency, and accountability. Finance and program have often been separate in school districts, but that time is past. With demands for greater student success, finance and management needs to be part of all program directions. So today I have titled my presentation, Back to the Future, Where Has the Money Gone? I will conclude that we are at a critical juncture and that it is time for us to act as an informed and united educational community. Okay. Let's see. Okay, now I did 2 at once. Okay. So my talk is about past, present, and future. I will show the steady increases we have enjoyed in education over the past 2 decades. I will review results of the 2013 budget, which show how the state is recovering from depressed economies. And I will pose the problem of how to balance the education students need and deserve with the resources the state has available for education. I will conclude with a discussion of goals that should guide an educationally sound, fiscally responsible school finance system. On this slide, the red line shows total expenditures per pupil and its steady growth over a 20-year period. The blue line shows state revenues, a flatter growth line that has faltered since 2008. This slide shows revenues from state sources as a percent of total expenditures, a roller coaster ride with dramatic ups and downs. It illustrates the periods of state fiscal stress in the early 90s, the early 2000s, and the current period we are in since 2008. This slide shows the breakdown in total revenues by federal, state, and local sources, and the temporary relief provided by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 in this period here. The data go to 2010-11. The ARA funds have been discontinued, and sequestration cuts required by the Budget Control Act of 2011 have been implemented, affecting many federal education programs. The laws of 2011 made changes to slow the growth of education revenues into the future. A property tax levy limit of 2% with certain exceptions and adjustments, and a cap on state aid increases tied to growth in personal income. This slide compares the historical growth in school spending, the dashed line, with an estimate of revenues limited by the two caps, the red line. Currently, there is a gap of $10 billion, and by 2016-17, the gap will be almost $18 billion. How are we as a state managing this gap? Are we eliminating mandates and preserving critical education programs that assure students are college and career ready? Or are we just giving kids less of what they need to succeed? As important as it is how we implement change in a growing economy, so too is it crucially important how we make changes in a challenged economy. The 2013 budget provided $21 billion in general support to public schools, an increase of $942 million, or 4.7% compared with the 2012-13 school year. Foundation aid increased $171 million to $15 billion overall, a little more than a 1% increase for the big four cities of Yonkers, Syracuse, Buffalo, and Rochester, a little more than a 2% increase for New York City, and about 0.3% increase for all other school districts. Still $5.4 billion from the promise of full phase-in of the foundation formula that was expected for 2011-12. The gap elimination adjustment was used to reduce school aid to respond to the state's budget shortfall. The 2013 budget restored $517 million of this cut, leaving a remaining reduction of $1.6 billion. The state budget also provided funds for continuing grants, $25 million each for management efficiency and performance improvement, and $75 million in new competitive grants for full-day universal pre-kindergarten, extended learning time, community schools, improved math and science instruction, and early college high schools. Other expense-based aids were allowed to run, providing in several instances modest increases for school districts. This slide shows the change in aid from 2007-8 to 2013-14 for foundation aid and other aids. You can see that foundation aid is the largest aid and it declined slightly over this period. Other smaller aids experienced steady growth. Looking closer at the change during this 6-year period, we see that foundation aid has been used as a regulator to help balance the state budget. Building aid and private excess cost aids have accumulated substantial increases, and transportation and BOCES aids have also grown steadily. Looking at the future, economic forecasters predict an economy with continuing constraints. The challenge, simply put, is how does the state provide the education children are entitled to and need for success with the resources the public is able to provide? The foundation formula enacted in 2007 was based on an inflated economy that is unlikely to return. As the economy returns, albeit at a slower rate, do we need to adjust the foundation formula so that it is sustainable with the resources we can expect? In order to assess this question, I suggest we have a discussion of what the goals should be for an educationally sound, fiscally responsible school finance system. But I just want to play devil's advocate on my own approach, have asked, why do we care about fiscal responsibility? What's this fiscal responsibility stuff? Isn't our job just to state what the needs are? And my answer to that is yes, the needs are the biggest job, and that is the most important job that we need to do. However, fiscal responsibility is also important for several reasons. First of all, the formula is more likely to be sustainable if we focus on fiscal responsibility. We will not get into the situation we've been in the last 4 years where we put out a formula, school districts expect it, and then it's not delivered. Also, a focus on the yield in terms of student results that we are getting for our money is more likely to help students actually improve their learning results. And we'll focus the whole system on that. And third, it is a bargaining strategy. If we focus on productivity, that is going to build a more favorable public image, which will translate into support for more education resources. I know John said we didn't need any more money. I do think we always need more money, but we need to also use the money better. And finally, we are charged with being good stewards of public resources. This involves ensuring that our students actually have the opportunity to learn and succeed. So the connection between resources and learning is critical here. So now I turn to you, my informed, knowledgeable, and dedicated New York State educational community. What are the goals or principles that should lead an educationally sound, fiscally responsible school finance system in New York State? And I would just ask you to throw out some ideas, and I'm going to write them down.
Just write them right on the screen.
Would you do that for me, John? What should be a goal of a school finance system that's educationally sound and fiscally responsible?
Must be
Equity. What else? Transparency. What else? Results. And in my mind, we're talking a little bit about adequacy. You can be equitable, which is fair, but if you use the money to get a certain level of success, that is adequacy. So results are adequacy in the school finance jargon. Okay, other goals?
Predictable.
Pardon?
Predictable.
Predictable. Okay, other thoughts? Sustainable. Yeah, because we can make a great formula as we did in 2007, and we haven't gotten very far. The foundation aid in 13-14 is slightly less than the foundation aid in 2007-8. Other goals?
Flexible, so that you have the ability to change and ebb and flow as you need to.
Flexible. Some flexibility for school districts to function and not be constrained. All right, good point. Other goals? Practical. What does that mean?
It means that the folks who are, the naysayers would not say that the system is just building a system to build it. It's based on reality and what's necessary.
Okay. All right. Understandable. I think that goes with transparency. And I think part of transparency and understandable is that education is a public good and should be able to be debated by the public. And if we can't understand education finance, it's hard to debate it. And that, I think, is one of the challenges of distributing money based on one formula and a number of factors and then taking it away with another formula based on a number of different factors. It's just hard to get your head around what's happening there. Okay, all right, excellent. Any other goals before that you're just burning to say? Okay, well, we do have some really good ones. And I prepared a list. Okay, all right, I was just wondering if I showed. Now, what have I done here? Okay, I guess I ended my show prematurely. So I prepared a list, and it is very, very similar.
You had it up there.
Okay, all right. Just got to be careful not to go too far. Okay, so equity, adequacy, finance linked to student success. The foundation formula in 2007 was the first time that we said we need resources at this level because that's what we need for students to be successful, and we defined what students being successful meant. Sustainability. Now, I had incentives for productivity, and I know John mentioned that too. He said we have a lot of resources compared to the rest of the country. Can we get a better return on investment from our resources? Predictability, transparency, accountability, I don't think came up in this conversation, but I don't think we can get away from accountability. And then we said practical and necessary and flexible. Those were things not on my list. What I am suggesting is that we need to identify some of these school districts that have educational insolvency and give them a lot of support for how they can improve their educational offerings. And so that's the support for organizational change goal. Okay, so at New York State ASBO, we believe we're at an important crossroad in school finance. We must eliminate the GEA and implement foundation aid in a manner that is educationally sound and fiscally responsible. We have started today and welcome an ongoing conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Our next speaker is E.J. McMahon, probably someone who needs no introduction, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute's Center for State and Local Leadership. I'm happy to say that he comes to us from a background in journalism. He was a former staff writer and columnist for my own paper, the Times-Union, as well as the Knickerbocker News. His frequent writings attract some of the most vociferous comments from folks on our Capital Confidential blog. Perhaps many of you are in the audience anonymously right now. So please welcome E.J. McMahon.
Blogging away.
Yes, blogging away.
Good morning. I would like you all to note that the umbrella on the couch out there is mine. Could you put that in display, please? Or oh, it's a PDF. I forgot because we had a problem. So never mind. Thank you. Actually, my main job is heading something called the Empire Center for Public Policy, and I remain affiliated with the Manhattan Institute also. My function here today is to put school spending in perspective, that is, in sort of a national perspective. Keep in mind that there are meetings like this and rooms full of people like this, if not now, around this time, gathered probably in 50 state capitals around the country, talking and worrying to various degrees about the same sorts of things, but we don't all start from the same point. And so my role today is to just sort of create a context that allows us to keep in mind what point we're starting at compared to other states. So that narrow red, if you can see it, that red bar on the left of this graph was New York K-12 spending per pupil in 2011, which was over $19,000 per pupil. That's everybody else. And as you can see, New York State towers above the rest. Now, this has actually been the case. We've been some years neck and neck with New Jersey during boom periods, and occasionally Connecticut surging up to the top three for about 40 years. I was going to double check the historical trend because I've looked at it before, and it's been entrenched for a long time. I couldn't do that because our friends at the Census Bureau and other federal agencies took down their website, in a way, throwing a sort of tantrum over the government shutdown. Although keeping a website alive and unattended would have no cost at all, they wanted to make sure that we understood that they can't put all that data up anymore. Go find it yourself. So that's what you get for relying. Don't rely on the cloud, folks. In the middle of that chart is the U.S. average. And New York is 80% above the New York average, above the U.S. average, and is actually somewhat further above the U.S. average than it's been in quite a while. We've been ranged from 60 to 80% above the U.S. average for quite some time. Next, here's just the U.S. and New York in isolation. So 2011, 19,000 for New York, 10,560 for the U.S. Now, to give you a further perspective, there are the top 20 states. As you can see, a lot of them, but not all of them, are states in our neck of the woods, more or less. New England, Northeast, Mid-Atlantic states tend to all be crowded in this top 20. The other states in the top 20 include some small commodity and mineral-rich states that are basically exporting their tax burden elsewhere, Alaska, for example, and have relatively small student populations and have always spent a lot per pupil. So that's one way of looking at the context of how New York spends. And you'll note New Jersey has fallen behind. They used to be neck and neck with us, but the nature of their budget crisis there dictated that they've begun spending less per pupil than us. Now, K-12 funding sources per pupil. One of the things that people are fond of bemoaning in Albany is that New York doesn't contribute as large a share of total K-12 expenditures from the state level as the national average. It actually is occasionally touched on the national average in recent years, but generally has been below it. However, I think it's worth noting that we are in the top 10 for state support per pupil. In fact, we ranked number 5 in 2011. We're also first in local support per pupil. We're the only state that's in the top 10 on both lists. States that have high levels of state support tend to have low levels of local per pupil support and vice versa. We do both, which is one of the reasons why we are so high. Now, this is an interesting chart. If you take all of the school districts in the country for which the Census Bureau and NCES had data in the 2011 school year, that's some 13,000 school districts plus, and you range them into quintiles by per pupil spending. By the way, in all cases, the per pupil spending here does not include charter school pupils or expenditures on charter school pupils. So there's the quintiles. U.S. quintiles of spending per pupil. And I've got the ranges there, what the spending per pupil is. How many New York school districts are in the lowest quintile? Answer, none. How many New York school districts are in the second quintile? Answer, none. How many New York school districts are in the middle quintile? None. In fact, by this time, going down this list and sorting out per pupil spending by New York school districts by quintile as measured by the census data on a fairly consistent basis, I began to think of somebody you may be a fan of, the radio host Garrison Keillor, and it began to occur to me that we have a sort of Lake Wobegon effect going on here. It's not till you get to the fourth quintile that you've got 58 New York school districts out of nearly 700 that are actually in one of the spending quintiles nationally. The remaining 623 are all in the top quintile. So it occurred to me that this is sort of a situation where in New York you might say the women are strong, the men are good looking, and all the school districts spend way above average. Not only above average, again, way above average in some cases. 399 New York school districts out of 623, over half obviously, nearly 60%, are in the top decile. They're in the top 10% of spending by school districts, including 204 of that 399 are in the top 5%, including many of our poorest urban school districts. So again, this is all in the nature of creating a perspective. New York is a fairly high spending place. And sometimes when these national statistics are cited, people will say, well, that's those downstate or suburban school districts that spend incredibly lavish amounts. They pull up the average. And again, school spending in downstate suburbs on Long Island, Westchester, Lower Hudson Valley, some of the suburban pockets upstate that are affluent, they do spend a lot. They are among the highest spending, most lavishly financed school districts in the country, which means they're the most lavishly financed school districts in the world, more or less. However, basically, if you go around and make a spot check of New York school districts, find their demographic twin in some sort of like state, not Mississippi, Pennsylvania, say, you'll find that the New York school district, by and large, spends more. I just went and got a couple of examples. Niagara Falls, New York, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania are near demographic twins. I won't bore you with the details, but if you look them up and look up their census data, poverty rates, etc., population, very similar. Niagara Falls, which had undergone a multi-year fiscal suppression, it basically had no tax increase for a very long time. So it's an interesting example here. Harrisburg, of course, is state capital, Pennsylvania. Niagara Falls, New York, not a high-cost location, spends 16% more per pupil. In 2010, sorry, I didn't go back to the census website till this week and realized I couldn't get it. I had not downloaded the data set, and now I can't. But obviously, the difference is probably fairly consistent in the more recent data. Spends 16% more than Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Another example, Buffalo and Pittsburgh. Now, Pittsburgh is larger than Buffalo, not that much larger. It is in a larger, more prosperous metropolitan area. It's actually doing better, much better economically than the Buffalo and the Buffalo environs. It has a somewhat smaller school enrollment, even though it's got a larger population. Buffalo is younger than Pittsburgh. Buffalo, after multiple years under the thumb of a control board that allowed absolutely no increase in teacher salaries, not even steps, for a period of several years, as of 2010, was still spending 13% more per pupil than Pittsburgh. Just a couple of examples you could pull. And the whole point of this is simply to say, in the case of building perspective, it's not just New York suburban school districts that spend more than national average than their counterparts. Although, by the way, if you pulled up a random middle-class Long Island or Westchester school district and compared it to Montgomery County, Maryland, or Fairfax County, Virginia, the difference would be larger. They spend a lot more than affluent school districts in most other places, or than Brookline, Massachusetts, or someplace like that. So what is the reason for the difference? This is not by no means a deep drill, statistically massaged, elaborate exercise. This is just for purposes of discussion and illustration. Why do we spend so much more? Basically, roughly 80% of the difference is instructional salaries and benefits. This really shouldn't be that surprising. Schooling is a people business. It's people intensive. When one says we need to spend more in our schools, and for the sake of argument, say, yes, we need to spend more in our schools, if somebody wants to make that argument. At the end of the day, you're talking about hiring more people and paying them more. We have larger staffs and we pay them more. That is why we spend, that's the principal reason why we spend so much more. Do we have a large number of school districts? Yes. That is not, underscore not, the main reason why we spend so much more on average than the average state. And even if you take New York City out of that, which some of you may already be thinking, New York City is one enormous school district with 1 million kids in it and one central administration, you still don't get that big a difference. If you were to basically eliminate half of all the central general administration in New York State, just wipe it out in one fell swoop, you'd save about 2% of basically total spending. Within a few years, you wouldn't even notice that it was gone, and whatever other effect it had would be something else. When you get further into these numbers, which requires more work and more detail than we want to get into today, and it's always an interesting discussion, you will see, well, what's the everything else? If like roughly 80% is instructional salaries and benefits, what's everything else? There are two categories that stand out when you look at these data. Generally, it's pupil transportation and building plant operation costs. We provide a lot of transportation services to non-public as well as public school students, and then parsing down that number to how much is the actual non-public share and how much is simply the way we choose to transport students would be another question. Physical plant costs, I have no idea why they're so high. That doesn't even include capital. This is just operating. So these are interesting numbers to look at. They don't, and I think that, again, it's meant to provide context and perspective. Other people like you are gathered in rooms like this around the country now or will be sometime in the next few weeks, talking about, speculating upon and bemoaning some of the same sorts of trends in their own states. They are generally starting from a much lower point than New York is, and I think that's worth remembering, and we can discuss what some of the implications are of this going forward, but my point today is simply to lay some of these numbers out so that they're part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks to E.J. McMahon. And now we'll hear from Michael Rebell, the Executive Director of the Campaign for Educational Equity, and the co-counsel in plaintiffs, or for plaintiffs in a lawsuit that certainly needs no introduction, the Campaign for Fiscal Equity versus the State of New York. In his capacity as a litigator in that case, he argued 3 times before the State Court of Appeals. Please welcome Mike Rebell.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So far today, we have heard discussions that put major emphasis on the fiscal constraint in which the state budget now exists, and some of the reasons for that, some of the fiscal implications at the present time and at the future time. But although John and Deborah alluded to the fact that we may be heading toward educational insolvency, I'm hearing much less emphasis on what the impact of this fiscal constraint has been on the students and on the ability of our school systems to deliver the opportunity for sound basic education, which the Court of Appeals, the highest court, strongly, firmly declared 3 times in the CFE case is the constitutional right of every child in the state of New York. I think the Constitution was not mentioned once in all of these discussions. So let me put this in a very clear perspective. Yes, we have to be fiscally responsible. Yes, we have to take into account all of these statistics and facts that we've been hearing about. And EJ, by the way, at the time we litigated CFE, the state came in and said we're the highest spending state in the country by far, and the court said that is totally irrelevant. The only question here is, are the kids getting what they need to get constitutionally? If you can deliver that at a lower cost, fine, but if you have to pay a higher cost because New York has higher standards, has higher inflation rates, whatever the cause, it's constitutionally irrelevant. The only thing that's constitutionally irrelevant is whether the kids are getting the opportunity for a sound basic education. And you know, when I put this in legislative terms, at the height of the recession, the governor at the time was Governor Patterson, was saying, I have a constitutional responsibility to balance this budget, and I'm going to do it. And I agree with him. Obviously, he has a constitutional right, he and the legislature, to balance the budget, a constitutional obligation. But he has an equal constitutional right to make sure kids are getting their opportunity for a sound basic education. That is written into Article 11, Section 1. And unfortunately, too little attention has been paid to that reality. I thought it was striking that John, in his overview of where we're heading in terms of educational insolvency, said there are trends, there are anecdotal indications of great problems going on. But he said, fundamentally, if you ask me what has been the impact of the constraints in the budget on kids in the classroom, his answer was, I don't know. It's an honest answer, and he's looking forward to more data from a new SED system and all of that. But what I submit to you is that may be an acceptable answer from an honest professor. It is not an acceptable answer for the governor of the state of New York, for the legislature of the state of New York, for the state education department. So I certainly agree with Deborah's emphasis on the fact that we have to look at new ways to be cost effective, cost efficient. We've got to find ways to deliver quality services at a lower price. I agree with that. I have my own ideas on that. I've published suggestions on that. I've raised a lot of points in the Governor's Education Reform Commission in which I sit, and one of the reasons I agreed to join that commission was that I thought we would roll up our sleeves and get serious about pursuing cost efficiency, bring those costs down without undermining kids' constitutional right to a sound basic education. For me, that is the balance that's got to be stressed at all times. That, yes, we should do everything possible to keep costs down, but only if we can keep the quality of education up to constitutional standards for our kids. So I want to get back to that interesting phrase that John mentioned, I don't know. Well, it is a dereliction of the constitutional duty of this state for the governor, the legislature, and the state education department not to be able to answer John's question. And if they can answer it, if it took 5 years to develop a data system, and I don't know how much longer to work it out, and let's see how much usable data we get, you don't hold kids hostage during this 5-year period and say, because I have to balance the budget, as Deborah said, we're going to use the foundation aid formula as the budget regulator. So if we need to fill a $2 billion gap this year, what we're going to do is come up with some mechanism called a gap elimination adjustment and just lop $2 billion off of foundation aid and say someday in the future, when we can, we'll reinstate that. Now, by using that device, they accomplish two things. One, as Deborah mentioned, they make the formulas totally unscrutable. Nobody even knows. You go out and ask the person on the street, what's gap elimination adjustment? Nobody knows what you're talking about. But even within those who know the education world, you ask, how was your gap elimination adjustment calculated this year? They have not one, not two, but I think Rick's going to tell us, they have 10 different formulas applying in all kinds of circumstances that is gerrymandered to figure out how to give back the little bit of decrease in the cut, which is what we got in the last 2 years, how to distribute that in a way that's politically acceptable. So I can tell you when we litigated CFE, and the court was astounded at the complexity of the formula, the fact that nobody, I think the anecdotal evidence, but we put it before the court and nobody disputed it. There are only 6 people in the state of New York who really understand the intricacies of this formula and how it works. I'm proud to say we have at least 2 or 3 of them up here. But it's probably worse. Figure out what that GEA formula is. So in any event, what we've gotten is these heavy cuts, and the governor saying, I have to regulate the budget to make sure that our revenues and our expenditures are in sync. But at the time, nobody asked the question, well, if we cut $2 billion from our foundation aid level, What's going to be the impact in the classroom? What's going to be the impact on educational opportunities for kids? They don't even ask that question, let alone try to answer it. So my answer to the policy perspective that the state has taken so far is, yes, you should work, follow up Deborah's suggestions. Let's have debates and discussions about all these issues of how we can be more cost efficient and more cost effective. But until you do that, you can't deny these rights to the kids. And if that means we have to have high taxes for a while, we have to have high taxes. If we can bring the taxes down, I'm all in favor of it. And I want to say one other thing about this question of taxes. Again, it's a question of balancing your priorities. Several people have mentioned we're going to eliminate mandates. Everybody talks about eliminating mandates. None of it gets done. So I'd like to have the debate between those who want to lower taxes for people and those who have ideas for mandates, and balance the lowering of the mandates against lowering taxes, but don't do what Governor Cuomo seems to be doing now by setting up a new commission whose mandate is to cut $2 or $3 billion in taxes. You don't do it in the abstract without weighing in the balance what's the impact on kids. So I would say to the governor, you come up with $2 or $3 billion in mandate relief where you're going to provide the same level of services to kids and offset it with tax increases. That's a conversation worth having. But by the way, it's not a conversation worth having yet because we haven't reached an equilibrium level of adequate services for kids. So really what we should be doing is saying, let's find out how much kids are hurting. Let's find out what revenue level we need under present ways of structuring the system. Let's make sure the kids get that level of funding. And then, without making the kids the experimental guinea pigs, let's say, okay, if we're at an adequacy level, let's now figure out if there's a way we can save more money, eliminate mandates that are unnecessary, et cetera, and then bring down taxes. But our priorities on this are in the inverse, and I think we really have to focus on this. And we have to take this seriously. Now, I'm just going to say a couple of more things. I don't want to go through the history of the CFE litigation. I did distribute a short handout, just puts it in succinct form. Every kid in the state has a constitutional right to a meaningful high school education, one that prepares them to function productively as civic participants. That is the right of all the kids in this state. And it's been interesting to me that we keep talking about those rights. We keep talking about the high standards. Despite the recession, I didn't see the governor, I didn't see the speaker, I didn't see the legislative majority leader or any serious effort to say, we can't afford this high level anymore. You know, New York had these high Regents learning standards. We can't pay for it. We're going to lower the standards. And by lowering the standards, they would lower probably the constitutional responsibility because it's tied to what New York will define as a meaningful high school education. Be honest with you, I always was a little worried during the litigation that, gee, the court's tying the standards to graduation standards and how the state is defining what a meaningful high school education is. What if they lower the standards? Well, fortunately they didn't. We still believe in high standards. Matter of fact, we believe in even higher standards because what we've gotten since the CFE decision is now an emphasis on college and career ready. And there's been some good work and some good thinking about what that means. But I'll tell you one thing it means. It means we now have even more damning statistics about what our education system is producing. Those statistics partially answer John's question because if we look at our minority students throughout the state, only 58% of them graduated on time, but of those, only 35% met the state education department's criteria for college and career ready. So if our standard now for high quality is college and career ready, 2/3 of our minority students are not meeting that. And that means 2/3 of those students are being denied their constitutional rights. So unless we're willing to lower the standards, I think we have to pay for decent education for those kids to get it. And again, what I'm trying to do here is right the balance in this discussion. I have no problem with Deborah, EJ, anybody else coming up with more efficient and more effective ways of doing this. I've been pushing for lowering special ed costs myself. It's an area I know. I think you can save $1 billion to $2 billion in that area. Nobody seems to take this seriously. I bring this up with the Governor's Commission and all, and what I'm realizing is we have huge political stumbling blocks. You know, there's no mystery as to why some of these expensive systems are in place. Logically, they're not rational. Logically, you could be much more cost efficient, but it serves somebody's interest. So when all the politicians keep telling me we don't have money to provide kids a quality education, do the kids have to suffer because the politicians are not going to stand up and take a stand on some of these issues that, yes, are politically difficult, but if we're serious about a balanced equation for making sure that we maintain kids' constitutional rights at the same time that we save money, that's where we should be looking. We should be looking at the political sacred cows that have been built up over the years and find ways to lower the costs without having a detrimental negative impact on the students. I want to just say one other thing about the Governor's Commission. I'm going to say two things about it. The first is I agreed last year when I went on that commission that as long as I'm on the commission, I can't sue the state for all these constitutional violations because I'm going to work within the system. But over the last year, I have become more and more concerned. The unconstitutionality of gap elimination adjustments and caps and all these things and deferring the promised amounts for CFE for 5 years beyond what the Court of Appeals said. I mean, from a legal point of view, this is like plucking fruit. This stuff is unconstitutional on its face. But if you bring a lawsuit, where does it bring you? What do you get out of it? There are a lot of systems we have to build up of data on what's wrong, reconsidering exactly what those formulas were 5 years ago. There are changed circumstances. So that's what I've been trying to talk to people about, trying to discuss. We've made some progress with the Governor's Commission. Again, instead of lowering standards, we're raising them, and that's fantastic. If we're serious about all kids graduating college and career ready, you've got to start early. You've got to start in pre-K. So we now have that commission on record as saying we need full-time pre-K on a truly universal basis for all kids in the state. We have the commission on record as saying we need extended time for kids who need extra services. The regents are cutting back on AIS services this year, but the commission took a position that all kids who need those services to be at proficient levels should be getting them. We need a full range of services to deal other services with a growing demographic of these poor kids that John was talking about. So I am pleased that we're keeping up the concept of educational standards with this commission. Unfortunately, some of these major funding issues, and I think Rick in a few minutes is going to spell them out in more detail and more specifics, so far the commission has not really taken up. And certainly that's one of the things I was hoping to get out of this commission. Our mandate is up in December, and I've been pushing to have a focus on all of these questions of gap elimination. How much do we need to have adequate funding? And I've been assured that the commission, it's part of the charge, we're going to get to it. Well, we had a hearing scheduled September 12th. We were finally going to get to it. That was postponed for unforeseen reasons. I'm told now it's going to be rescheduled for sometime in October. So I'm still hoping. We're going to have this hearing sometime in October, and then we're going to come out with our report in December. So I'm ever an optimist, and I'm going to bring some of the new facts I learned today, lay them all before the commission. I hope when the hearing is announced, it's probably going to be in Rochester, that some of you will show up. But the clock is ticking. And the clock is ticking not only for the commission to deal with this issue and come up with its report, but for 3 million kids in our state who have been deprived of the resources they need for the last 3 years. So I think if we don't get some real movement from the commission, from the governor's executive budget this year, there probably is going to be another major lawsuit before the beginning of the legislative session. And we will, one way or another, really have to work to right this constitutional balance. Thank you.
We love it when people make news. And now, last but not least, Rick Timbs, the executive director of the Statewide School Finance Consortium, and someone with a career in ground level work in education as the district superintendent, now retired, of various districts in Western New York. He was also the chair of the Western New York Joint Management Team, which included all BOCES in that region of the state. Please welcome Rick Timbs.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, it's like Old Home Week. I saw my hometown, Niagara Falls, displayed as a high-spending school district, and it's really kind of interesting to take a look at some of these data because they are important. And I think every panelist so far, I've got to thank them for really bringing a new perspective to this conversation, and it's great to be here. You must have all listened to my propaganda since 1995 because all of your suggestions that you gave to Deborah were actually on the moniker for the Statewide School Finance Consortium. They were equity, adequacy, transparency, predictability, sustainability, and the formula must be understandable. So I'm glad our work has finally surfaced with this group. But what I'm going to do is kind of take you through some of the data, and I think the data speaks volumes. So I'm just going to hope you can follow along here. This is kind of an interesting concept. What we've done here is we've actually divided up the wealth factors of a school district into 10 parts, really 10 deciles. And really what I've got is number one decile over here. Is this the red button? What is the red button? Okay, this one here. This would be the poorest school districts in the state. And this is really based on what they call CWRs, combined wealth ratios. So these are the property and income values of school districts across the state. So if we took the bottom 10% of value of the CWRs, the combined wealth, property, and income values of the schools in New York State, they would average really about 0.39. Now, what's a 0.39? Well, 1 is average. If 1 is average, 0.39, those school districts actually have income and property value about a third of the state average. So by the time we get to 1, however, please note that we're somewhere between the 7th and 8th decile. So a huge number of school districts in the state of New York are really below average wealth. But it's more than that. Below average wealth means that they don't have the income. These people have 1/3 the income of these people right over here and property values on average. So these people here are probably struggling. We would call it, from my neighborhood, dirt poor. And there's 10% of the districts. If you notice, the next decile isn't much better. They don't even achieve half the state average. And the next one is a little above the half the state average, and so on, until we get above the state average at 1.16. Of course, like all data, these are about 3 years in arrears, because what happens is property income values are actually calculated into this CWR 3 years in arrears. But what we see is this huge climb after this to 1.61, which is really a tenth of a point above average, and then the 10% of the highest wealth districts in the state are at average 5.74. The highest is over 52, just to give you an idea of range. So what I'm going to do is, I always believe that I was always taught, and I was always told, constitutionally, those who have the least should get more. That was the whole idea behind the distribution system in the state of New York. So what I'm going to do is going to flip it over, and we're going to take a look at who got what in terms of the GEA. Now, this is actually the governor's proposal for the restoration of GEA. Now, what do I mean by restoration? We call that the reduction of the reduction. Okay, so this is like I was supposed to pay you $10 a week. Only last week I paid you $7, and you're really upset about it because I took money away that you were supposed to have. And this week I'm going to give you a raise. I'm going to give you $7.25. So you feel a little bit duped. But what happens is they're trying to restore some of it. Now this is the governor's curve based on decile. And if you'll notice, their curve does give the least the most, and the people who are the wealthiest the least. So technically speaking, it looks like it's a great curve. But if you'll notice, look at the real distribution of the money in the red line. The curve should really follow that line. So I think the governor had like the right idea, and I really thank him for it because I think he's pointed out that the people who really need it the most should get the most reduction of their reduction. This is the legislative analysis of what they wanted to improve on the governor's run. Now you'll notice that follows the curve pretty dramatically. Actually, no, not actually at all. It doesn't even look like they belong on the same graph. It looks like, Rick, you've made a mistake. Shouldn't that be on a different graph? Well, what they're trying to do is actually create a political document rather than one based on equity, one based on adequacy, based actually on anything that has anything to do with schools other than a political document. So if you were to add the two reductions of the reductions, which they're calling restorations, together, you get actually this graph here, the one in kind of like a blue-purple up there. And if you'll notice, that graph really doesn't look very equitable. So technically speaking, what we have is the poorest districts in the state of New York got a restoration of, on average, $381 per pupil, and the wealthiest got $228. But if you'll notice, it doesn't quite follow the curve. They got more all right, but the big question is it enough? But look at the little tail here. I mean, where the heck did that come from? So the top 10% of the school districts in the state of New York in terms of wealth, property value, income, program, everything you can possibly imagine. Okay, for all I know, they're planning a lunar mission in science class. I don't know. But look at the effort, the huge effort it was to get them more money. Matter of fact, they have more money coming back to them than their poorer counterparts in these two deciles. That makes absolutely no sense to me, but apparently it makes political sense. I think this goes back to Michael's point. Distribution of state aid isn't supposed to be a political document. It's supposed to help children. It's supposed to be equitable. It's supposed to be adequate. And therein lies our problem. So what was the end result of all this? So this is the current GEA by these school districts after the reduction of the reduction, commonly known as the restoration. So what we have here is we have the poor school districts still have $561 per child being cut in the GEA. Oh, by the way, gap elimination adjustment, easy way to remember it. Someone had a gap, they decided to eliminate it, so they adjusted something. The state had a gap, decided to eliminate it, so we adjusted our aid down. Okay? So what happens is they're losing more, but look at over here. These people here are still losing more than these people. And these people are the wealthiest people in the state of New York. They have the wealthiest kids in the state of New York. They have more programs than anybody in the state of New York. They have better results than anybody in the state of New York. What's going on? Why aren't we following this curve? Because there's no political will. Part of my organization's duty is to create one. Right now we're creating agita, but we'll hope we get to political will. This is the distribution of every school district in the state of New York. What I've done is I kept the curve up there so you could see it. And this is the distribution. So if I take a look at these people who are the poorest school districts, this is how it's distributed, how much they lose per pupil. Now, basically, these people are more alike than they are different in each one of these groups. But notice the huge distribution. The formula does not make any sense. It doesn't create like partners in a like circumstance. So what we see is the whole formula for the GEA, the 10-step formula this year. If you notice, it looks like they came up with, all right, here's what we're going to do. So we'll come up with this formula. Oop, that didn't get everybody. All right, let's come up with another formula for the people that don't do well there. Oop, we didn't get everybody. Okay, well, let's see. Let's try another formula. Let's add a formula to the first two formulas that didn't get everybody. Whoa, gee, we didn't get some of these people. Okay, and they did this 10 times over until everybody got something. But by doing that, it actually, from my neighborhood in Niagara Falls, it would be called skimming. Because the pot is only so big on how much they want to get back. Every time they add another group that they want to give more money to, especially the greatest number of wealthy districts, they must skim money from the total pie. So they skim it off the top. And therein lies the problem. For years, we've been doing this, and for years, we have this problem. So here's another measure. This is FRIPL, free and reduced price lunch, that John alluded to, and I think that Michael's been talking a little bit about. So what we have here is, here's the FRIPL curve. The poorest districts have an average FRIPL of 0.71, which means technically almost 3 out of every 4 kids in their classroom are of poverty. That's pretty poor. And when you compare it to, in some of these districts, or the same districts, have that low income and property wealth. I mean, people say, well, you know, they've got to support their schools. There's nothing to tax. They own nothing to tax. I was down in Middletown, New York, last couple nights ago. I drove down through the hinterlands all the way down there, and you go through some of these communities, and honest to God, you'd think they've abandoned the place. There's really nothing to tax. But their kids are entitled to the same education as everyone else's. So what we've got here is, look at this curve. Shouldn't these people have the least amount when they have the highest educational burden? I live next door to Utica, New York. 47 languages are spoken in the high school. They have a huge growing enrollment. Where's the help? How do they do this? What do they do? Well, they struggle. Because what happens is we have a political document that either in property and income value nor in FRIPL poverty rates, it makes no sense at all in terms of equity or adequacy. These are all the districts up to CWR of 4, because after 4 it gets really redundant. They're doing well. If we went to the top 52, I'd have to have the thing all the way over to the other room over there. So what we've done is actually, what I'm trying to point out here is that we've got to take this group of people and bring them up. They have to have a greater reduction of the reduction. I mean, not a little greater reduction of the reduction, a greater reduction of the reduction, because they are struggling mightily. Now, the data that we've seen so far goes back to 2010 and how they've used fund balance, and I'm going to bring you up to date. The truth of it is, school districts have 3 things at their disposal. They can cut program, they can cut staff, or they can use fund balance, and that's it. The tax cap has really constrained us. But my suggestion is the tax cap is a symptom. It's not the problem. With the proper aid to these districts, they wouldn't struggle as much with the tax cap. Now, exactly how much has the reduction been in total? Over the last 4 years, the GEA has totaled $8.5 billion. That is more within the same period of time as the amount that was supposed to be dedicated to the full amount of foundation aid over the period of time, over the 4 years it was supposed to phase in, between 5 and 7 billion. So this curve has got to be followed when we start looking at these school districts. And the legislature has to get the courage to do this. But there's another group too. I need the Board of Regents to do it. They're the ones who are coming up with all the new ideas in terms of the standards and so on. Whether you like them or hate them, whether you like the assessments or hate them, if that's going to be the new standards, the rule in life is you can have anything you want as long as you're willing to pay for it. I really expect the Board of Regents to come up with one great state aid plan this year to pay for the new standards, and nothing short of it will do. They have to stand up with the rest of us. If they want more, they've got to stand up and demand more. Not only production from school districts, but also providing the resources for those school districts. So what actually happens here is the foundation aid is kind of like frozen in time somewhere. It's supposed to be phased in over 4 years. Now, I had a rough time with the foundation aid formula. It was good at the start to a point. But there are parts of that formula that were actually put in there to, again, skim off money to wealthier districts to make sure, quote, everybody got something. And we had a political document so certain senators and assembly people could go back and say, look, I brought home the bacon. The truth of it is it skimmed off too much. And it never reached full implementation in terms of phase-in. Well, here we go. I've actually calculated over the years with the help of SED documents exactly who's overfunded. There's 151 districts in the 13-14 year that are overfunded $137 million. Now, how is it possible to be overfunded? Because the formula was frozen. But look at the demographics of these people. Look at the average CWR. It's 3.066. Look at the median, 1.38. These are not below average wealth districts that are overfunded. These are above average to wealthy districts that are overfunded. So meanwhile, while we're giving them more reduction of the reduction, we're simultaneously overfunding them in the foundation aid formula. So double damage. Now let's just take a look at it. Is this just a phenomenon for 1 year? No. This was last year. It was 136. So if there was 136 last year, and look at the CWR last year, 3.3, and the average 1.5. We're still doing it year after year after year. They can go to our website, www.statewideonline.org, and you'll find basically, you can look up any district and find out if they're overfunded or underfunded. But what we're finding is there are actually poor districts that are overfunded, and there are wealthy districts that are overfunded. This formula doesn't even come close to working. If we look at further data, look at the underfunded. There's 525 districts underfunded, but how much? Only by $5.4 billion. Meanwhile, the GEA is sitting at $1.638 billion. So they're out of kilter by over $7 billion as we sit here. $7 billion is a lot of money. I don't think the state has it, but the state put us in this position because we have had these political documents. They've got to get us out of this position. It's kind of like when I was a superintendent. If something goes wrong, I always felt it was my fault because I'm the one who wanted the job. Well, Rick, you know, the basketball team lost. What are you going to do about it? You're the superintendent. You wanted the job. You wanted to be in charge. So we're saying the same thing basically to state government. If they keep helping us like this, I really see our demise. So what has happened is really we have a whole bunch of people. And by the way, 1 year you could be overfunded, and 1 year you could be underfunded. I mean, it is just hysterical. We also have on our website, so you can find out how much GEA each district has lost. So I looked at it cumulatively. I said, okay, let's just take a look at a series of districts. What if they had a CWR less than or equal to 1.4? So I'd say about average to below average wealth districts, and they had a FRIPL above 0.24, which would mean they have basically 1/4 of their kids living in poverty. What are the demographics of them? Well, New York City, for instance, foundation aid would then be $12 billion underfunded. Look at the three of the big four. It's an enormous amount of money, and they are struggling. We have two of the big four who are actually using bookkeeping techniques to stay solvent. They're booking 1 day ahead of the end of the fiscal year federal funds, chapter funds. Do you understand what I'm getting at? So that they, as if they showed up to balance their budgets. It's no good. It's no good. Look down here at the second chart. Number of districts, 386 cumulatively overfunded. In other words, when you add it all up over the whole period of time that the foundation aid formula has been there, $10 billion underfunded. And we wonder why they're struggling with coursework, why they're struggling with staff, why they're struggling with offerings, why. I'm working with a school district. I went in the other day and I said, listen, how many kids, I was looking at the data, I can't find it. How many kids were in high school AIS last year? Oh, none, Rick. I said, but your Regents results, to be honest with you, are terrible. Yeah. Well, how come there were no kids in AIS? Well, we don't have any money. We laid those people off. Well, where are we going with that? So this becomes a constant problem. So I start looking at where's the money going. So here's really restricted fund balances, the actual for 12-13 and the estimate for 13-14. Now, people say, well, these schools seem to always be going under, but they never seem to go under. Isn't everybody saying, you know, they're going to go under every year? How come they never go under? Well, that's because luckily there's been a number of us, I think, battling for state aid increases or the reduction of the reduction. And last year we got almost $1 billion, and that is keeping us afloat. That is a temporary life preserver. And a lot of those districts did, as you see in the actual 12-13, they actually tried to rebalance their restricted fund balances. They tried to put more money in. But simultaneously, as they moved into this year, they had to take almost $200 million out. So this is their basic savings account. Now figure it out. If we actually got $1 billion in aid and simultaneously they took $200 million out, then the cost of the business is really $1.2 billion to keep it afloat. If you look at the next one, the appropriate assigned fund balance, you'll notice that again, is being reduced. Now, why would that be reduced? Well, it's being reduced because they're cutting their budgets so much so they won't need the appropriated fund balance because they can't generate the appropriated fund balance because they're running out of reserves to do it with. And if we look at the last one, the unrestricted, this is the cash on hand. We just jettisoned again $177, almost $178 million. That's a 12% decline in the cash available for those school districts. The other problem we've got is this tax cap is causing agita because what happens is the state aid doesn't come forward. Then they have to rely, as it's pointed out by a number of speakers, on the local taxpayer. But they're only willing to pay so much. And unfortunately, they really don't usually understand how schools work. So what happens here is that while we were able to jettison $136 million last year in exclusions. Now, what's an exclusion? Well, the exclusions in the tax cap calculation are really two parts, really, generally. To oversimplify, they're the pension costs that you're allowed to exclude, and they're capital expense that you're allowed to exclude part of it, your local share. Well, the interesting thing is you can eliminate the pension costs if you simply eliminate the staff. Well, that won't work because we're a people-intense business. What about the capital part? Can you eliminate the capital part? No, because what happened is, how'd you get the capital part? The voters actually approved you to spend the capital part. And now you're actually asking them to reapprove it. So hypothetically speaking, every project I've done for the last 15 years, I'm almost need voter approval again to raise the money to pay for the bill. But what districts are doing is they're finding out that when they do that, they get above 2%. So what they're trying to do is they say, I'll just pay for it myself. I won't raise it in taxes. Well, where does that money come from? Easy, one of three ways: program, staff, or fund balance. The figures are right up there. This year, we're expected to actually leave on the table, I call it, $241, almost $242 million. Notice we won't collect it from the taxpayers, even though it's due to us, because it would send us over the tax cap. But if the state aid was forthcoming like it was supposed to be, we wouldn't have this problem. So some people are making their problem our problem. This is a shifting burden issue. This is a list. They'll have this for you available. I'm sorry it's so small, but what I actually did is took all the counties in the state of New York, and the tax cap calculation now, that little 2% number, varies by year. And right now for municipalities, it's 1.66%. Maybe ours will turn out close to that. But the interesting thing is, if you didn't collect the money that you were supposed to collect in the tax cap because you were afraid to lose your budget, you actually then artificially decrease or depress your levy. And the first number entered into your tax cap calculation is the levy number. So it's a declining balance you're going to have available to you. So what I did is I went there's 423 districts in the state of New York that if they increase their budget by just 1%, they will exceed 1.66 if that was the tax cap amount. You've got to be kidding me. They're already in trouble. We haven't even started on their budget yet. 1%. The 1%, we have unions and people and administrators and superintendents have taken pay freezes for years, and now you know what they're saying? Time's up. The state should have figured this out by now. We did our part. We're not working for nothing anymore. We're supposed to be valuable employees. You want new standards? There's a tremendous pushback. So this ought to be interesting. Now the one on the right, this is kind of like one where your district go broke idea, but it's not exactly that. But here's the idea. The idea is this: your appropriated fund balance used to come from when you underspent your budget and you got in more revenues than you thought you were going to get. You could then take that money and turn it around and turn it back to the taxpayers as you're supposed to. And then you would have that appropriated fund balance. But these budgets are getting so tight, they can't generate that delta revenue to expenditures. They can't do it, so they have to rely on reserves. So this is a little exercise on if you took all the money that your school district has, no matter where it is, whether it's unrestricted, sitting there in the bank as cash, or if it's restricted for that $1 million tax certiorari claim that you're supposed to pay, or if it's in there for your when your employees retire, or if it's in there for your capital project, no matter what it is, if you were to use just that money alone, without cutting staff, without cutting program, exactly how long is that sustainable as a practice? Well, it's not. 1 year for 37 districts, it would be 2 years for 131, and under 3 years for 239 districts. Spending every penny they have. Now remember, the money in reserves is generally for a current liability. So if I have $1 million in a tax cert reserve, it's because somebody's trying to get $1 million out of me. They will still have to pay all those bills. So this is a real sorry condition. This next one basically is dividing them up in terms of who's who. So let's just focus really in on this bottom set here because of time. There's 423 school districts, I told you, but take a look at the mean average for these school districts. 0.65, 0.59. The people who are in trouble are poor. The people who are not in trouble are not. The distribution has to change, and it has to change rapidly and extensively right away here. We can't wait any longer. I think what's actually happening here is, the way I look at it is this. If you take a look at that, you're jettisoning in your school district in school districts across the state $370 million, and we got a $937 million increase in state aid, then technically speaking, the cost of doing business to keep us afloat, so we didn't go under this year as predicted, was $1.3, $1.4 billion. Therefore, unless the entire GEA goes away next year, we will actually lose ground. So the data is pretty compelling. Now, if you check on our website, we have all kinds of data you can look at across the state and all types of things, and you can compare what's happening. But without a doubt, the data reveals the people who have the least have the most problems, and they're really not being taken care of. And it is an equity issue. And I think Michael is right. These children are being deprived of sound basic education. There's like no doubt. Some schools, I go in now and I say, do you have a teacher aide you could photocopy this? We have no teacher aides. Is there a teacher assistant's got a free period? We have no teacher assistants. AIS is now, according to Region, only the ones, right? In other words, if you're almost passing the standards, but you still can't pass them, we don't have to remediate you because you're broke. It's a bad message. I think we've got to pull ourselves up with the bootstraps. I think we've got to do better. I think schools can be more efficient. They can be more effective. And more money is not always the answer. But it seems to be the answer when you're not the one getting it. We spend billions on education. That's true. But not everybody is. Some of these school districts have one foreign language. They have no family and consumer sciences, even if it's required. They have little technology, even if it's required. And nobody's looking. I know of no one studying to find out who doesn't have what. So I think big changes have got to come. And I think we can all be part of it and involve ourselves in this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Rick Timbs and everyone on our panel. Please give them a big hand. I have what I hope will be some very quick questions, and then I want to open it up to yours. First off, the panel comes to this issue from various points of view: progressive, conservative, academic, legal, administrative. But is there anyone who would argue with the idea that that the current aid formula that the state is using is Byzantine, unworkable, and that it is that way by political design? No one?
Well,
Yeah, go ahead and
I think the key thing is I think
and feel free to move the mic closer.
I believe that it's more of a political document than anything else. I think what's actually happening now that I think is very unfortunate is it's become such a political document that it's going to be a heavier lift to right the ship. We've never advocated a Robin Hood approach to this type of thing, whereby you simply take money away from someone to give it to someone else. But so much money has been actually sent to people who need it the least, and you can't get it back. Now the lift to get it to the people who need it the most will be heavy. And therefore, I think what happens is we have called for actually a New York State Education Reform Commission that actually has no politicians on it. And I think what we need is really experts in the field who study this, such as Bruce Baker from Rutgers and other people who really study these types of data to come up with a solution to this thing that the legislature basically has to embrace regardless of the political fallout, because if we don't, we can't move forward, and I believe we will be in a more difficult situation.
EJ.
I mean, I don't think we should be shocked to observe that the school aid formula is a political document. Politics is the result of living in a democratic society. Please don't take what I'm about to say as a defense of the legislature, as opposed to an explanation of the legislature. Inequities especially on the downside, in times of fiscal stress, fights over the equity of aid cuts have been around for decades. Is anybody here in the 1970s? Some people in the room, I think, maybe share my ability to remember the 1970s. Remember Save Harmless? Remember those battles? It happens, okay? It's exacerbated by the pronounced, really remarkable historic decline in the political influence of upstate New York, which is where most of the districts Rick is talking about are located. And I think that's partially reflected in that chart. But at the end of the day, let's reflect on the fact that after the inequity in restorations that Rick points to, in other words, in the hermetically sealed laboratory environment of matching curve to curve, there is an inequity in the restoration of aid. Nonetheless, you have a situation where, for example, to name two extremes, the city of Buffalo, last I checked, gets $13,800 per pupil in state aid, and Scarsdale gets $800. I mean, that is still the basic outline of the school aid formula. It's not pretty. Nothing they produce in the state capitol is pretty. It's the worst result except for all the alternatives. And it's been particularly bad in recent years. There's been a particular level of disingenuousness. I would say one of the most disingenuous political acts in recent memory was Eliot Spitzer pretending that he could deliver on the foundation aid promise, even from the perspective of early 2007. It was preposterous on its face, and it was unsustainable even if the economy had not nosedived to the extent it had. So let me, again, consistent with the title of my presentation, add that perspective to this discussion, because the political nature of the discussion and of the way in which school aid is distributed is not going to change. So I add that into it.
Mike Rebell.
I've just got to give a quick retort to that last statement. Not that I generally go around defending Eliot Spitzer, but on this one I will. For the 5-year period before the legislature adopted the 2007 formula that called for a total of $7 billion over 4 years in state aid increases, state aid had increased over $1 billion a year anyway. That's when George Pataki was governor. So the state was managing to move in that direction. Instead of $1 billion a year, it was going to talk about $1.2 billion in foundation aid. It was going to get a lot more equity, not perfect equity. So I do think under the economic circumstances of the time, it was a feasible and realistic, ambitious, but it's what the Court of Appeals told them to do. Throughout New York City, hundreds of thousands of kids were not getting a sound basic education. And when the state ed department and the legislature went back and looked at it statewide, they said obviously in Buffalo, Rochester, a lot of the rural districts that we've been talking about today, they're also not getting a sound basic education. So that's the level of funding we need. I don't think it was unrealistic. Since we've had the recession and all, I do think we have to reconsider financial factors. I've said that time and again. But not at the kids' expense. You can't just say do more with less, which is the governor's message. It's the last 3 governors' messages. You can't just say that without knowing you've got the constitutional responsibility as the state to show school districts how you can do more with less without taking it out on the kids. And some of that is these heavy mandates that are politically untouchables.
My last question will be, and Rick Timbs touched upon this a little bit, no or few educational stories that I've looked at this year has been hotter than the adoption of the Common Core standards. We could spend a day at least discussing what Common Core and what the adoption of those standards will have on the subject that we're talking about. And maybe this goes to John Sipple's distinction between educational versus fiscal insolvency. But what will Common Core mean for the issue of today? Or is it merely a change in rulers, inches versus centimeters?
I'll tell you one quick thing. It's a litigator's delight on the statistics that are going to come out over the next couple of years.
I think what's going to happen is people are going to be further from the goal. I think it's interesting. The people who are opposed to the Common Core, I think they're starting to coalesce a couple of groups. One is I think people are starting to see that their children are really hamstrung right now trying to reach the current curriculum and trying to do well on that, and that's causing a certain amount of distress. Additionally, they see then the standards increasing rather rapidly, and they see just greater distress and more pressure on their kids. I think additionally, there's in the schoolhouse door, there's a tremendous amount of stress, and I think the kids feel it, see it, and sense it, and it goes to the parents as well. And additionally, I think there's a lot of people out there who are saying, boy, is this going to cost a lot more money? And I think they're saying we just don't want to pay anymore because they see maybe the state is reluctant to hop in.
My sense on the Common Core is that when done well, this will provide a wonderfully rich educational learning experience for kids. The trick is, how do we get to that wonderfully rich educational learning experience for kids? Really good teachers who have the time to prepare to really instruct in multiple ways to get deeply rooted in these Common Core themes and projects and topics will do that, and the students will benefit from that. Trick is when you look at a teacher who's teaching 13 kids, another teacher teaching 27 kids or 35 kids, and whatever professional development dollars are behind that. Dollars typically come out to time for the teachers to prepare. We were going to have a whole slew of ill-prepared teachers to implement the Common Core and a whole slew of well-prepared teachers to implement the Common Core. And I think we have a guess as to where those teachers are distributed across New York State.
All right, now I'd like to open it up to.
Could I add to that?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I think the Common Core has reframed the arguments, and this is very timely. The recession has derailed our funding system, and this has sort of happened around the world, so that's not a big surprise. But it just shows now that we have to get back to work and piece this thing together again. We're going to do it in the context of the Common Core, and I think that is hugely important. If we did it with the lower standards and then 5 years later said, oh, well, now we got to do it with the Common Core, that wouldn't help us.
Deborah, I just crossed my Cunninghams. I would now like to open it up to questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question. We have mics that will come around, and please just wait until the mic gets to you. So from either room. Oh, there you go, around the corner. Please go ahead and come step out so they can see you.
Hi, I'm Allison Armour Garb, and I have two questions about potential sources of efficiencies that could help solve our school financing problems, and I'm asking these questions as a devil's advocate. One would be around the idea of consolidation of school districts, and rather than looking at just consolidating a few school districts here and there, what about the idea of regional school districts that are aligned with labor markets and eliminating the donuts and that sort of thing? And the second question is around staffing, which, as we saw, is the biggest nut in the budget. How about if, when we had those regional school districts, administrators had greater authority to hire, fire, assign, and pay educators within the larger districts? Thanks.
I'll take the consolidation one and let somebody else tackle the second one. A more bold, what you're referring to is a much more bold proposal than let this little trickling of individual communities going through 6 votes to merge two districts, which are typically small, rural, poor communities. And when you merge them, you're going to have ever so slightly less small, poor, rural, little communities, and all that goes with that. We're saving relatively little money, because when we do merge, what we know from our history is that we level up contracts and we level down tax rates. And we slightly increase transportation costs, we slightly reduce administrative costs. But there's a little money to be saved, but it's never as much as we kind of hope it would be. So to move to a much more bold strategy, as either countywide districts or as you're talking labor market-based districts, is I think an interesting idea. The politics of trying to create a district around, to subsume these donuts and make that one district would, personally, fabulous. I would never bet even $1 that that's going to happen. I think the politics of that are just incredible. How much would that save? We can go through some estimates of that in terms of reducing administrative costs, gaining efficiencies in transportation systems, gaining efficiencies in even APPR costs, and we can go through the ramifications of all that. And my hunch is we probably could save some dollars. But boy, it's the thought of getting politically to get to that point where we would ever do that. I just don't see that happening at all.
Yeah, I would agree completely with John. I think there's a possibility for maybe countywide school districts saving a few dollars, but not necessarily. The problems are not just political, like on a statewide basis, they're political local. I've done a lot of studies on a whole bunch of things, and my doctoral dissertation, by the way, was on the merger of school districts and school district consolidation. I've studied it for 20 years. I found no evidence that it's ever saved a penny at all in New York State. Maybe in other states, yes, but not the way New York State operates. But the thing is, making it bigger, I think, is going to cause some issues, I think, locally, because right now, even in small districts that are looking at merger, the common elements that people bring up all the time are, well, we're the Mustangs. And for some reason, this seems to be important for a lot of people, and it is a lot of people. I've actually seen superintendents lose their job trying to change the mascot. And that's no joke. The other thing, too, is, we moved next to that elementary school so our kids could go there, and now you're telling you're going to close it? Or we're going to go to the other side of town? In some cases, it's racial. We got to go with those kids? So there's a whole bunch of dynamics here that are not quite as easy as they sound. And I don't think we're even close to there yet in New York State, because I think we have a long history of community schools and community input into those schools. In terms of staff and that type of thing, I became a teacher just the year before the earth cooled. And so what happened was, it was 1970, and I was basically told that here's my salary, and I would coach 3 sports, and I would do this, that, and the other thing. I would be the advisor to this, that, and the other thing. The Taylor Law was new. Within a year, I was the union president, and of course, not everybody's a fan of the Taylor Law, but what I found out is it protected my women colleagues because they were given absolutely nothing and actually had lower salaries than everybody else, which I thought was kind of interesting. But the veterans there told me, well, gee whiz, when there's really no rules, here's what happens. It's back to favoritism. And I think I don't mind stepping back and having easier way to get rid of teachers who are not competent or are incompetent or don't do their work or are not proving that they can help these kids achieve. I'm all in favor of that. But there's got to be protections as well for everyone, because I think otherwise it turns into something very arbitrary and capricious. I think we've gone a little overboard in some of these things. I think we certainly need relief in the tri-borough. I think we need relief in a number of other things, but I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I'd like to make just one quick comment, and then I'll let others speak on the consolidation discussion, which I do think needs to take place. Even though I try not to advocate one way or the other, I want to make sure we have good, clear, clean decisions when they're made locally. One motivation for consolidation is to try to save money, and this is what typically is talked about. The other motivation for consolidation is to ensure that kids who are attending very sparsely populated schools actually have a fair shot at getting a legitimate education that prepares them for the new world. And so I think if we hold as a standard, we're only going to consolidate if we're going to save money, I think that cheapens the conversation, and we need to have this other part of the conversation that we may want to consolidate around counties, around BOCES, around and maybe around the donuts, who knows, that one of the goals would be to truly enhance the educational offerings to all kids so that it really doesn't matter what zip code a kid is growing up in. They have a chance to take the full set of courses that kids in other areas have.
Another question. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to
Okay.
address that?
I just wanted to say that the state of Nevada has 17 school districts, and they went from just under 300 school districts to 17 in the 50s. By legislative fiat, they just did it. And so it can be done. But in New York State, we have such a long history. I think John showed, going back to the 1800s, how the localities paid for almost all of education revenues. We have this New England town hall model. We have still a great amount of property taxes that are paid by the localities, and we have a number of quite wealthy districts that really don't need to consolidate. So I really don't see that happening. On the question about greater administrative authority to hire and fire, I really I just want to point out that there is a principle in accountability. If you want greater results, you have to provide greater flexibility. In our discussion of goals, the issue of flexibility and practicality did come up. So I do think if we are serious about getting better results, we have to give more autonomy and more flexibility at the local level.
Another question from the audience. Yeah? Yes, sir, please.
I'm Bob Lowry from the State Council of School Superintendents, and I'll direct my question chiefly to E.J. McMahon. In full disclosure, he and I have spoken about this and corresponded about it, but, you know, facts are facts. Yes, we are number one in spending, and by a notable difference from other states. Why is that so? Why do you think we spend more than other states, significantly so?
Well, I mean, and as you and I have discussed, what the numbers would suggest, just on the face of it, which leads to another why, is that we have more staff and pay them more. And it's not just a matter of higher average salaries. We have the highest average teacher salaries, and again, it sometimes varies from 1 to 3 by the decade, but I think it's 1 now. But it's not just a matter of high average salaries. It's a factor of staffing levels. We have high staffing levels, and schools throughout the country have shrunk staff in recent years, so I imagine our ratio of staffing is still the same. If you look at staff to pupil ratios, we're heavily staffed. If you look at class size, have smaller than average class sizes, but we're not an outlier. So there's something about the staffing. And I think that I would love to be able to have the opportunity to still explore that question in further detail, because as you and I have discussed, I suspect, and I've been interested in what Mike Rebell's had to say on this, because I've seen you quoted on this elsewhere. I suspect that special ed has a lot to do with it, to the extent that it's something uniquely structured in New York. And I think more attention needs to be paid to answering that question, because I don't pretend to know the full answer to it. The numbers show, the basic answer is you got more people and you're paying them more. Putting aside the paying them more as a certain separate issue about which I have opinions, the staff size is an issue driven by those dreaded mandates and also by habits of being, perhaps, that I think deserve more exploration. I also would like to comment just one little bit about, it's always interesting to me hearing discussions that revolve around accountability, governance, leadership, and performance in schools. The education unique in the professions. That people in the education community assert that teachers have to be immune from superiors who play favorites and might make arbitrary decisions. I've had this discussion with teachers, some very good teachers who are really superior teachers, well known in the field and highly regarded, who've told me quite sincerely, the problem is if we didn't have tenure, we could have bosses who were arbitrary, who didn't appreciate our abilities or just didn't like us, and they would make unfair decisions, and we wouldn't get raises when we deserved, and other people would be promoted who didn't deserve it. To which I said, well, welcome to my world. That's the way it is in every field. But if you want to succeed, if you want to achieve, if you want to produce results and be a superior organization, the people who run in that organization and participate in it know that they won't do that if they play favorites, promote people who are unaccomplished or unqualified, and who do the other things that people who fear in education fear would result from what I would call a more normal way of organizing and running and managing organizations. I'm sorry, but I don't think that argument holds water. Having said that, I get my acronyms in education mixed up. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. Is it APPR? That's the new evaluate based on test score. I don't hold with that at all. I think that's the result of efforts to have this sort of clumsy automatic way of saying we're evaluating teachers now. We've got a metric here, and that's a way to avoid confronting the tenure issue, and it's a way to avoid actually running schools more sensibly. And I don't think it's smart.
The metric I will walk away from this session with is FERPL curve, not only because it's intelligent and a good metric, but also it's so much fun to say. I think Tim, you had a question. If we could get Tim Kramer and Mike.
I just want to kind of put in a plug for we put in a merger study a couple weeks ago. We did a study, and along the lines of what you were saying, John, we found it clear, both in a qualitative and quantitative way, that enrichment of the academic program was the only thing that was driving any interest in doing this, and not saving a few bucks. And I hope people will look at our website regarding that.
Tim, introduce yourself for the.
I'm Tim Creamer, the
few
Executive
people.
Director of the New York State School Boards Association. I forget the number of, one of you had the number of school districts and the consolidations and how it changed dramatically in 1970. And then, Rick, you just mentioned the fact that the Taylor Law came into terms, I think, 68 or something like that, and unionism started along. Do you think there's a link between the slowdown and consolidations and the growth of unionized personnel?
No, I don't know that, I have not studied it, so I can't tell you that there's a correlation or not. It just seems to me that it became a comfort factor. You know, you get down to a certain unit, and let's put it this way, the transportation to and from school was achievable. Kids weren't on the bus over an hour. The school was actually able to provide the accoutrements that people expected for their children. And I think that's why they consolidated into these central school districts during the 60s into the 70s and slowed down. What you find, though, is and I think you and John are absolutely right, money's really not the reason. It's really to provide student opportunity and to enhance the student experience. But there's no evidence it improves performance. But
one other suggestion, though. We can't consolidate any further, apparently.
Well, people seem unwilling to.
On rare occasion. But
given current regulation.
In current regulation, is there a midpoint where maybe regionalized collective bargaining units would make some sense and maybe save some money and provide for a level of adequacy and equity in a regional basis?
I would have loved that back in 1970, because then what we would have done is, in my school district, we would have been paid the highest salary of anybody in my region. So actually, what we do is see regional bargaining leveling up. But what I think is the opportunity maybe for consolidation of some services would be, for instance, regional high schools and things like this that I think a lot of people have promoted. So I think there's certainly can provide additional opportunities there. I think also the other thing, too, is we've got to start looking toward community colleges. Actually, I think what we have to do is start triaging our work. Perhaps as an ex-high school teacher, I could tell you that I had students really that I felt probably could have done just as well without me if they had actually moved on to college earlier. If this makes any sense to you, and taken some higher level courses we couldn't offer, and I could have spent more time with kids who needed more remediation and help. So I think there's other approaches out there that are available.
Well, I think we have time for one more question, if somebody in the audience has one. If not, I'm going to take it. Anyone? Yes, right there.
Hi, Liz Davis from the Controller's Office. I've had the mixed pleasure of looking at state budgets, both proposed and enacted for the last 2 years, just as part of our little budget review. And, you know, you're not going to get any argument from me that it's obviously a political document. But, you know, I just question what you actually think we can do to change that, because every year you get the governor's proposed budget, and it almost doesn't matter what governor. It's going to be something somewhat coherent, cohesive. It's going to have, maybe won't meet everybody's standard. Maybe they're going to make an attempt to do something they think will be more politically palatable. But what comes out of the legislature never matches. It's always a lot more complicated. It's always a lot more convoluted. And I have to say, as a parent, you know, my kid is starting in the high school of one of the low-need districts. And I was amazed and appreciative of all the wonderful offerings that are available to all the different kinds of kids, and they're not that different from each other. But I also noticed that in the budget proposal, they were going to really reduce our high tax aid. And I said, I wonder how long that's going to last. Didn't last. You know, the high tax aid money went right back. The proposed change to, you know, by the legislature to, you know, maybe change the formula a different way. Okay, so everybody got some. It's that same skimming effect. Everybody gets a little, which means that the places that really need it don't get what they need. So what do you do other than, you know, going and pleading? But how do you actually change that? Because that is, I think, the toughest nut.
You know, when you pointed at me and said pleading, I don't know if you meant going to court and pleading a complaint. But seriously speaking, We track these fiscal equity and adequacy litigations around the country. There have been litigations in 45 states. And it is a very interesting pattern that if you want to get rationality and budgeting that follows in the main large principles, you look to the remedies in these different lawsuits. And sometimes I get a lot of pushback in my teaching and my writing and all about courts shouldn't be meddling in these matters. It's for the legislative branch and all of that. And yes, it is. But what the court can do is not only promote equity when things are out of balance, but it promotes a certain amount of rationality. And when you get clear principles, which we did in CFE, the follow-through is usually much more clear and much more equitable. So I'll go back to Eliot Spitzer's 2007 Budget and Reform Act, which did largely, it was imperfect in some ways, but it's as good as you get in terms of legal remedies, and it's as good as you get in terms of a somewhat rational approach to distributing state aid. I hope there are other ways of doing it, but this is one way if it has to come to that.
Yeah. Hi, Liz. For whatever it's worth, and I trust Mike's opinion much more than me, is that the only way to get at this is take it out of the hands of legislators and make it apolitical, to make it rational, where there's a coherent argument, a coherent thought. And whatever that entails as far as people's criticism of democracy, if the courts take this over, I think if indeed there is a constitutional obligation by the state of New York to fulfill its obligation, the only path there is through litigation, in my non-legal opinion, being a non-lawyer. That's I hate to sound so hopeless otherwise, but I don't see it.
We would agree. That's why we're suggesting a non-political commission. The legislature, for one reason or another, not that they're bad people or whatever, I think the thing is all things are locally, politically, and I understand that. But they're either unwilling or unable to solve the dilemma. And I think then we need other minds to attack the problem.
All right, well, I think that's all the time we have. I will be going back to the Capitol, and I will spread around the idea that perhaps school funding should be handed off to a non-political entity. I'm sure that will catch hold. And yeah, ending on a... That was meant to be a laugh line, but it became an applause line. So I would like to thank our outstanding panel, John Sipple, Deborah Cunningham, Rick Timbs, E.J. McMahon, and Mike Rebell. Please give them a big hand. And thanks very much to our hosts, and thank you for coming as well.